My name is Claire Thompson, and 6 weeks ago, I thought I had my life all figured out. I was a 29-year-old public librarian in a quiet corner of Oregon, living in a modest one-bedroom apartment above a bakery and counting every paycheck twice before buying anything beyond groceries. I had grown used to the gentle rhythm of my days cataloging books, helping kids find their first chapter novels, and volunteering at the community center on weekends. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. Then in one phone call, my world was ripped open. The police officer's voice was careful, like he was holding something fragile. "Miss Thompson, there's been an accident. My grandparents, Robert and Eleanor, had been driving home from their favorite jazz night at the local club when a drunk driver blew through a red light at 60 miles an hour. The impact was instant," they said. They didn't suffer, as if that made any difference. I hung up the phone and just sat there staring at the steam curling up from the mug of tea in my hands, wondering how life could still look so ordinary when everything inside me had been hollowed out. My grandparents weren't just relatives, they had raised me. My mother was gone before I turned 3. My father buried himself in business travel that kept him conveniently unavailable, and my grandparents stepped in without hesitation. They taught me how to ride a bike, sat through every school recital, and even helped me sew my prom dress from scratch because I couldn't afford the one I wanted. I thought about the night before, when Grandpa had called to remind me to always keep a flashlight in your car because of the storms rolling in. How could that have been the last time? The funeral came fast, a blur of formal condolences and cheap floral arrangements. My father Daniel stood at the front, speaking like a CEO, presenting quarterly losses rather than a grieving son. My stepmother wore sunglasses inside the chapel. My half-brother Ethan scrolled through his phone during the service, the pale blue glow lighting his smirk. And then there was Aunt Lillian, my father's younger sister, crying with a kind of theatrical force that evaporated whenever the photographer from her country club turned away. But I wasn't thinking about them. I was thinking about the house on Cedar Hill where I had spent every summer with its wraparound porch and the scent of cinnamon rolls drifting from the kitchen. I couldn't imagine it without them. 2 weeks later, an email arrived from a law firm I recognized, Carter and Miles. My grandparents' attorney, Mr. Alan Carter, wanted me present for the reading of their will. It was a formality, I thought. My father had always assumed he'd inherit everything. He once told me, half joking, that I'd probably get a nice keepsake if I was lucky. That morning, rain drummed against my windshield as I drove downtown. I wore a simple black dress and the silver locket Grandma had given me for my high school graduation. Inside the firm's office, I found Mr. Carter, silver-haired, soft-spoken, waiting in a conference room that smelled faintly of leather and old books. He smiled sadly. "Your grandparents spoke of you often, Claire. They were proud of you." I barely had time to thank him before the door swung open, and my family arrived all at once like a wave of expensive perfume and bad intentions. My father checked his Rolex before sitting at the head of the table, as if it were his rightful place. My stepmother perched beside him, eyes scanning the room like she was appraising a piece of property. Ethan slouched in with sunglasses and a coffee the size of his ego. Aunt Lillian trailed behind, still mid-phone call. We settled in the rain, tapping against the tall windows, and Mr. Carter began to read. The legal phrasing was dense, but I caught enough to know this wasn't going the way my father expected. When Mr. Carter reached the key line, "Bequeath our entire estate, including all financial assets, properties, and holdings, to our beloved granddaughter, Claire Thompson," the air seemed to drop 10 degrees. I froze, sure I had misheard. My father didn't. His chair scraped back violently as he shot to his feet. "What the hell is this?" he barked. My stepmother's voice followed, dripping disdain, to a librarian. "She can't possibly manage that kind of money." But Mr. Carter wasn't finished. "Your grandparents left a recorded message to explain their decision." He pressed a button, and there they were on the screen, Grandpa in his cardigan, Grandma in her favorite blue scarf, looking into the camera like they were looking right at me. "If you're watching this," Grandpa began, "it means we've gone. We want you to understand why we've chosen Claire. She has lived her life with integrity, compassion, and independence. She visits because she loves us, not because she wants something. She's earned our trust." Grandma's voice softened the edges of the words. "Daniel Lillian, we love you, but we cannot ignore the years you treated us as an ATM rather than family. This is our legacy, and we trust Claire to honor it." The video ended. Silence filled the room, but it wasn't peace, it was the stillness before a storm. And if you've ever wondered what happens when money exposes the truth about families, stick around, because what came next showed me just how far people will go when they think you have something they deserve. Before we go on, tell me, have you ever seen someone's true colors come out over money? Share your story below and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what happened when my family decided to come after me. My father didn't sit down right away. He stayed standing at the end of the table like he was the one running this meeting, glaring at Mr. Carter as if the man had personally rewritten the will to spite him. "Claire, this is absurd," he said, his voice shifting into that corporate tone he used in boardrooms, where every word was calculated to sound reasonable while dripping with condescension. "Your grandparents weren't thinking clearly. They meant for this to stay in the family." I almost laughed at the irony. Stay in the family, meaning, of course, under his control. My stepmother nodded like his echo. "Managing wealth is complicated, dear. You're young. You work in a library. You've never handled anything like this." She tilted her head, her diamond earrings catching the light. "Why don't we work something out that benefits everyone?" Mr. Carter stayed quiet, his eyes flicking toward me as if to check whether I wanted to respond. I didn't, not yet. My father pressed on. "Here's what makes sense. You sign the estate over to me as the head of the family. I'll manage it properly. You'll get a generous share, say 10%. That's more than enough for your needs." 10%. He said it like it was a gift, not a massive reduction from what my grandparents had entrusted to me. Ethan perked up, pushing his sunglasses up onto his head. "Yeah, Claire, that's like millions. You could still live comfortably and I could finally start my podcast network. It's a win-win." I had to bite back a retort. Ethan had been through 6 big ideas in the past 3 years, none lasting more than a few months before he moved back in with my dad. When I didn't answer right away, Aunt Lillian leaned forward, her voice taking on a sharper edge. "What did you do to them? How did you convince them to cut out their own children?" "I didn't," I said, finally meeting her eyes. "I didn't even know what was in the will until 10 minutes ago." "That's hard to believe," she snapped. I could feel the air tightening like the walls were closing in. Mr. Carter cleared his throat gently. "Claire, you don't have to make any decisions right now. My office will handle the estate for the time being. You have the right to take the time you need." My father gave him a look that could have sliced through steel. "This isn't over," he said. "Come to the house tonight, 6 o'clock. We'll sort this out as a family." It didn't feel like an invitation. It felt like a summons. I nodded once, mostly to end the conversation, and walked out with the envelope of documents Mr. Carter had handed me. Outside, the rain had turned into a fine mist, the kind that clings to your hair and seeps into your clothes. I sat in my car for a long time before starting the engine. My stomach felt like it was full of stones. I knew exactly how this would go. They'd talk over me, try to guilt me, maybe even threaten me. My father had never liked hearing the word no. By the time I pulled up to their sprawling house in the suburbs that evening, the driveway was already lined with cars. My father's black Mercedes, my stepmother's gleaming white SUV, Ethan's obnoxiously loud sports coupe. I gripped the envelope tighter and walked up the front steps. They were waiting in the formal living room, a place so pristine it looked like it belonged in a magazine, spread not an actual home. My father stood by the fireplace, glass of scotch in hand. My stepmother perched on a stiff chair, her smile tight and insincere. Ethan sprawled on the couch, scrolling on his phone. Aunt Lillian paced near the window. "Sit down, Claire," my father said. "Let's be reasonable." Reasonable in his mind meant I'd agree to his terms. He launched into a speech about responsibility and family loyalty, painting himself as the only one capable of managing the estate. My stepmother chimed in with little asides about how stressful it would be for me to deal with all that money. When that didn't land, they shifted tactics. "We gave you a good life," my father said, "paid for your education, your apartment." I interrupted before he could finish. "You didn't give me my life. You gave me the bare minimum. Everything else came from Grandma and Grandpa." Ethan snorted. "Wow, ungrateful much." The conversation spiraled. They alternated between pressuring me to sign papers I hadn't even been given yet, and warning me about the costs of holding on to the estate. My father finally produced a document from a folder on the coffee table. "Sign this tonight, and we can put this whole thing behind us." I took it, scanned the language, and felt my jaw tighten. It was broad enough to sign away everything money, property, even the company shares, without any guarantee of what I'd get in return. I set the paper down. No. The room went silent. My father's expression hardened into something cold and unfamiliar. Think very carefully about your next move, Claire. You can either be part of this family or you can keep the money. You can't have both. I looked at each of them, searching for even a shred of real care. I didn't find it. Then I guess I'll keep my grandparents' wishes. And if you think that ended the fight, it didn't. It was just the first punch in a battle I didn't ask for but couldn't walk away from. Before we get to that, I'd love to know, have you ever been pressured to give up something that was rightfully yours, just to keep the peace? Tell me in the comments, because what happened next will make you rethink who you trust. When I left my father's house that night, the threat still echoed in my ears. You can't have both. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, not from fear exactly, but from the dawning realization that this was never going to be a civil disagreement. This was war, and they weren't going to fight fair. I drove aimlessly for a while, headlights cutting through the mist as I tried to untangle my thoughts. Every mile between me and their perfectly manicured driveway made it a little easier to breathe. But the truth was, I had no plan. My apartment lease, co-signed by my father, suddenly felt like a trapdoor under my feet. When I finally parked in front of my building, the street was quiet, only the hum of the bakery's refrigerators below breaking the stillness. I carried the envelope from Mr. Carter upstairs like it weighed 50 pounds. It sat unopened on my kitchen table while I made tea, stared out the window, and told myself I'd deal with it in the morning. I didn't get that chance. The next day, a letter slid under my door, formal letterhead, legal language, and a cold statement in black ink: your lease has been terminated. Vacate the premises within 30 days. The landlord's signature was missing because technically there was no outside landlord. The building was owned by a holding company tied directly to my father. It was leverage, pure and simple. I called Mr. Carter immediately. He didn't sound surprised. Claire, they've been preparing for this since the will was read, but so had your grandparents. That's when he told me about the safety net they'd built, without ever saying a word. 5 years ago, my grandmother had purchased a small cottage outside of town. It was tucked behind a row of cedar trees, invisible from the road, and kept in a trust with my name on it. Your father doesn't know it exists, Mr. Carter said. You'll have somewhere to go if you need to. It was the first good news I'd had in weeks, but it barely had time to sink in before the bad news arrived, literally. My phone buzzed with a text from Ethan Hope. You're enjoying playing heiress. Don't get too comfortable. We're coming for what's ours. A second later, another ping, this time from Aunt Lillian. We'll be at your place tomorrow morning to pick up family heirlooms. Don't make this harder than it has to be. I stared at the screen, my pulse hammering. This wasn't bluster anymore. This was them announcing they'd walk right in and take whatever they wanted. Mr. Carter's voice on the other end was calm but firm. Don't open the door for them. I'll be there at 9 and we'll have company. I didn't know what he meant by company until the next morning, when the knock at my door came not from my family but from a tall, broad-shouldered man with silvering hair and kind eyes. Carlos Ramirez, he said, removing his cap politely. Your grandparents' estate manager. They asked me to look after you if anything ever happened. He wasn't alone. Behind him was Dorothy Ellis, my grandparents' housekeeper for 20 years, carrying a bag that smelled faintly of fresh cinnamon bread. They came in, settled at my kitchen table, and in a matter-of-fact way began to tell me all the things my family didn't want me to know. Carlos had updated the security system at my grandparents' house last year. New cameras, cloud storage, no blind spots. He had footage of my father and Ethan entering the house after the funeral, leaving, with jewelry boxes and electronics. Dorothy had found my grandmother's leather-bound journals, meticulous daily entries about family visits, or the lack of them. Page after page described how my father only showed up to pitch investments, how Aunt Lillian criticized their embarrassing old furniture, how Ethan treated them like a bank with no repayment terms. And then there were the entries about me baking bread with Grandma, helping Grandpa plant tomatoes, spending Sundays watching old movies together. She never asks for anything, one entry read. She doesn't even know the extent of what we have. She's here because she loves us. I had to look away for a moment. It was one thing to know I had a different relationship with them. It was another to see it in ink in her careful script. By the time Mr. Carter arrived, my tiny apartment felt strangely crowded, not just with people, but with proof. Real, tangible proof that my grandparents' decision wasn't some whim. He listened to Carlos and Dorothy, flipped through the journals, and nodded. They documented everything. They knew this day might come. Then he looked at me, his expression steady. Claire, tomorrow when your family shows up, we're going to be ready. We're not just going to defend what your grandparents left you. We're going to show them they can't rewrite history to suit themselves. The words settled over me like armor. For the first time since the will had been read, I felt the faintest spark of something that wasn't fear. It was resolve. And what happened when they walked through that door? That's when this fight stopped being about money and became about exposing exactly who they really were. If you've ever stood your ground against people who underestimated you, let me know in the comments. And if you're new here, hit subscribe. You'll want to see how tomorrow unfolded. The next morning, I didn't wake up to sunlight through my curtains. I woke up to the sound of heavy boots on the hallway floor outside my apartment. Carlos was already up, standing by the door like a soldier on watch. Dorothy sat at the table with her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, her eyes fixed on the door. At 8:45 a.m., there was a sharp, deliberate knock. Not the kind that waits for permission, but the kind that expects the door to open now. Carlos glanced at me and I nodded. He opened the door, but only partway, his frame filling the gap. There they were. My father, Aunt Lillian, and Ethan, dressed like they were attending a hostile board meeting rather than a family visit. My father's gaze swept over Carlos like he was a piece of unwanted furniture. "We're here for the family property," my father said flatly. "Let's not drag this out." Carlos didn't move. "You're not coming in without Claire's consent." "She is my daughter," my father snapped, "and this is my building." Actually, Mr. Carter's voice cut in from down the hallway. "It's owned by a holding company that's now under review by the state attorney's office. You might want to choose your next steps carefully." He appeared with 2 uniformed officers behind him, not arresting anyone, but making their presence impossible to ignore. My father's expression flickered just for a second, but Aunt Lillian stepped forward, clutching her handbag like a weapon. "We're not here to argue," she said, feigning civility. "We just want a few heirlooms, things that belong to the whole family." Dorothy stood then, her voice quiet, but cutting through the tension. "You mean the heirlooms you took 2 days after the funeral I cleaned the empty shelves myself? Would you like me to name the dates and times?" Aunt Lillian froze. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. Carlos stepped back just far enough to let Mr. Carter in. He set a folder on the table in front of my family. "These are copies of security footage from the Jenkins property. They clearly show each of you removing items without authorization." And here he slid another document forward, is the section of the will specifying that all personal property transfers to Claire with no exceptions. My father's voice dropped into a low growl. "This is absurd. We're family. This could have been handled privately." "You tried that," I said, finally speaking. My voice surprised even me, steady measured. "And your version of private was threats and eviction notices. So now we're doing it the right way." Ethan leaned on the table, trying to reassert control. "Claire, you're being manipulated. These people," he gestured at Mr. Carter and Carlos, "are just after their cut." I almost laughed. "They were in my life before you learned how to shave. They're not here for a cut. They're here because my grandparents trusted them, just like they trusted me." For a moment, no one spoke. The silence was thick, broken only when one of the officers shifted his weight. Mr. Carter closed the folder and tucked it under his arm. "You can choose to walk away now, or you can escalate this and deal with the consequences in court. But make no mistake, every document, every piece of footage, every journal entry is ready to be submitted." My father looked at me, and in his eyes I saw something I hadn't expected: calculation. He realized, maybe for the first time, that this wasn't a game he could win with intimidation. Without another word, he turned and walked down the hallway. Aunt Lillian hesitated, her lips pressed thin before following. Ethan lingered a second too long, glaring at me like he could burn a hole through my resolve, then left without closing the door behind him. Carlos shut it gently. The click of the lock sounded like the first deep breath I'd taken in weeks. Dorothy exhaled, shaking her head. "They'll be back," she murmured. "I know," I said. But now I also knew something else. This wasn't about surviving them anymore. This was about winning on my terms. Mr. Carter's phone buzzed. He read the message, then looked at me. "They've already contacted a lawyer. We'll need to prepare for a formal challenge to the will." I didn't flinch. "Then we'll be ready." And in that moment, with Carlos standing guard, Dorothy clearing the coffee mugs, and Mr. Carter already mapping out the next steps, I felt something solid under my feet again. Not just safety, but the first glimpse of control. They thought they could force me out. Instead, they'd just locked themselves into a fight they couldn't win. The call came just 2 days later. I was grading papers at my kitchen table when my phone lit up with a number I didn't recognize. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail, but something told me to answer. "Claire, it's Aunt Lillian." Her voice was syrupy sweet, the kind that makes your stomach twist when you know it's fake. I didn't reply right away, letting the silence stretch until she filled it. "We've decided to have a family meeting, just to clear the air. No lawyers, no police, no drama. We all just want to talk." The pause in her voice was calculated. She wanted me to be the one to say yes to make it feel like my choice. "Where?" I asked. "At your father's place," she replied. "Tomorrow at 6 p.m. Bring yourself, that's all." I almost laughed. The last time I brought myself, they tried to corner me into signing away my inheritance. "I'll think about it," I said, and hung up. That evening, Carlos and Mr. Carter sat across from me listening as I relayed the conversation. Carlos's jaw tightened. "It's a trap," he said flatly. Mr. Carter nodded. "But it's also an opportunity. If they try anything illegal, we can document it." That's when Dorothy leaned forward, eyes sharp. "Then go, but don't go alone." The next day, I walked into my father's living room and felt every muscle in my body tense. They were all there, my father, Aunt Lillian, Ethan, and even Cousin Marcy, who usually stayed out of family fights. A large man I didn't recognize sat near the door, arms crossed. Hired muscle, I guessed. On the coffee table sat a single manila envelope. My father gestured toward it. "Claire, inside this envelope is a document that can end all of this ugliness. You sign it and we all move on. No hard feelings." I didn't sit. "What does it say?" Ethan smiled, smug. "It transfers the estate into a family trust run by all of us equally. That way, no one feels cheated." My pulse was steady, but inside my mind was racing. "So I'd hand over the property, the accounts, everything my grandparents left me, so you can manage it." Aunt Lillian sighed dramatically. "You make it sound sinister. It's about fairness." Fairness. I repeated slowly, would have been you showing up for them when they were alive. Fairness would have been you helping with hospital bills or cleaning out the house instead of stripping it bare. The man by the door shifted, clearly uncomfortable. I wondered if he realized this wasn't the kind of dispute he thought he'd signed up for. My father's patience snapped. "Enough. Sign it." I met his stare. "No." The room froze. For a moment, no one breathed. Then Ethan stood towering over me. "Claire, don't be stubborn. This is your family. Do you really want to burn every bridge?" "Some bridges," I said quietly, "are better burned." That's when Carlos stepped in from the hallway, his phone held high. "Everything you just said is on record. Keep going if you'd like to make our case stronger." Ethan's mouth snapped shut. My father's eyes darted between Carlos and me, and something in his expression shifted, not defeat, but the first hint of realizing they weren't in control anymore. Mr. Carter stepped into view. "This meeting is over. Any further communication will go through legal channels." Aunt Lillian's smile cracked. "You'll regret this, Claire." I shook my head. "I regret trusting you, that's all." Walking out into the night air felt like breaking through the surface after being underwater too long. Carlos glanced at me. "You okay?" "I'm better than okay," I said. And it was true. For the first time, I felt the weight starting to lift, not because the fight was over, but because I wasn't facing it on their terms anymore. And if you've ever had to stand up to people who thought they owned you, tell me about it. I want to hear your story. That's not just me asking for comments. It's me building a circle of people who understand what it means to fight for what's yours. Your words might just be the thing that gives someone else the courage to do the same. I wish I could tell you that after that so-called family meeting, things cooled down. They didn't. If anything, the gloves came off. 2 days later, I came home from work to find a large cardboard box sitting outside my apartment door. My stomach sank before I even opened it. Inside were my clothes books and framed photos, things I'd left at my father's house years ago. On top of the pile was a folded note. In thick black marker, it read, "Since you've chosen not to be part of this family, consider this your official goodbye." I didn't even have to guess who wrote it. The blocky letters were unmistakably my father's. I stood there in the hallway holding that note, feeling an odd mix of anger and relief. Anger, because it was such a petty, theatrical move. Relief, because in a way, he'd just confirmed something I'd been slowly accepting. I was no longer bound to them. Not emotionally, not materially. When I brought the box inside, Carlos was already there waiting with takeout on the kitchen counter. He took one look at my face and didn't ask a single question, just opened his arms. I let myself stand there for a moment, breathing in the smell of soy sauce and sesame oil, the warmth of someone who was on my side without conditions. The next day, the landlord knocked. "Claire, I need to talk to you," he said, shifting awkwardly. "Your father called this morning, said he's the co-signer on your lease and wants to be removed, which means—" I finished the sentence for him, "which means the lease is void." He nodded apologetically. "I'm sorry, but you'll need to find another place within 30 days. It was a calculated move. My father knew I didn't have much savings beyond what Mr. Carter had advised me not to touch yet. They wanted me scrambling vulnerable. But instead of panicking, I heard Dorothy's voice in my head from weeks earlier. Don't fight them on their terms. I called Mr. Carter that afternoon. They've cut me off, both emotionally and apparently from my apartment. His tone was calm, almost amused. Then it's time we move to the next phase. The house. The house? Your grandparents' home. It's yours now, Claire. Fully paid off, quiet neighborhood, and most importantly, out of their reach. We'll start the transfer paperwork tomorrow. That evening, Carlos drove me over. I hadn't been there since the funeral, and the sight of the white porch and the old oak tree in the yard made my chest tighten. Inside, it smelled faintly of cedar and the cinnamon tea my grandmother used to make. The walls were still lined with their books, the curtains still neatly tied back. It was like they had just stepped out for a walk. I walked room to room, running my fingers along the shelves, the banister, the worn kitchen table. This wasn't just a building. It was the one place my family's cruelty couldn't touch. A place they'd never lived in, never cared for, and therefore couldn't twist into a weapon. In the study, I found a small locked cabinet. Carlos raised an eyebrow. "Should we—" I smiled faintly. Later, one battle at a time. We ordered pizza that night and sat cross-legged on the living room floor, surrounded by unpacked boxes. For the first time in weeks, I felt something I hadn't dared to safety. The next morning, I woke to sunlight streaming through the window. There was no thumping bass from a neighbor, no footsteps pacing angrily in the hall, just the sound of birds in the oak tree. I made coffee and stepped out onto the porch, watching the street below. This was my space now, my fortress. And here's the thing, when you finally take control of your space, it's not just about walls and a roof. It's about reclaiming the mental room to think, to plan, to breathe. So, if you've ever been forced out of somewhere by people who wanted to see you small, remember sometimes the best revenge isn't shouting back. It's quietly building a place they can't touch. The first night in my grandparents' house felt like stepping into a memory and a promise all at once. I kept wandering from room to room, as if I needed to convince myself it was really mine. The creak of the stairs, the way the afternoon light poured in through the lace curtains, every detail was a fragment of my childhood. It was the place where I'd learned to ride a bike in the driveway, where my grandfather taught me how to make perfect pancakes on Saturday mornings. Now it was my sanctuary. I woke up the next morning to the smell of rain. It wasn't just rain. It was the kind of soft, steady drizzle that made the oak tree leaves outside glisten like glass. I padded into the kitchen, barefoot, poured a cup of coffee, and stood at the window for a long time. The quiet here was different. It wasn't the uneasy silence of my apartment after a tense phone call. It was the kind of silence that wrapped around you, told you that you were safe. By mid-morning, I started opening boxes I'd brought from the apartment. Most of them were full of my essentials, clothes dishes, my laptop, but one caught my attention. It was labeled simply Study. Inside were papers, photo albums, and a small wooden box with a brass latch. I recognized the box instantly. It had always sat on the corner of my grandfather's desk, and I'd never seen him open it. My hands hesitated for just a second before lifting the latch. Inside was a neatly folded letter addressed to me, written in my grandmother's looping handwriting. "Claire, if you're reading this, it means you found your way home. This house was always meant to protect you, not just from storms or winters, but from people who can't see your worth. Keep it. Live in it. Fill it with laughter again." My throat tightened. I set the letter aside and noticed a small envelope tucked underneath. Inside were the original deed papers and a note from Mr. Carter confirming the transfer into my name. It hit me, then they'd planned this. My grandparents hadn't just left me money. They'd left me roots. That afternoon, I decided to start reclaiming the space. Carlos came over with paint swatches and a box of tools. We walked through the rooms, imagining what they could become. "This could be your reading nook," he said, pointing to the sunroom. "And here, this dining room, imagine hosting people you actually like." We laughed, but deep down the idea planted itself. For so long, family gatherings had been a minefield. Maybe here I could create a new kind of family. Around 4 p.m., my phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me pick up. "Claire." This is Dorothy." Her voice was calm, but there was an urgency under it. "I need you to know the rest of the family is meeting tonight." I overheard them. "They're angry you've moved into the house, and they're talking about contesting the will again." My stomach twisted, but I didn't panic. "Let them," I said quietly. "They don't know what's coming." Because the truth was, I was starting to see the shape of my defense. This house wasn't just a home, it was evidence of my grandparents' intent. And soon, I'd have more than sentiment on my side. That night, I sat on the porch with a blanket around my shoulders, listening to the rain start up again. I thought about the years I'd spent trying to earn approval from people who had no interest in giving it. I thought about how quickly they'd turned on me when I wouldn't give them what they wanted. This house was more than shelter. It was a turning point. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to their moves. I was setting my own. And here's what I've learned: when you finally have a place that's yours, a place you can lock behind you and know no one can take it, changes you. You stop flinching. You start planning. I had no idea then that the next piece of the puzzle would come from Mr. Carter himself, and it would change everything. 2 days after moving into my grandparents' house, Mr. Carter called. His tone was warm, but carried a quiet weight, like he'd been waiting for the right moment. "Claire," he said, "we need to meet in person. There's more. Your grandparents wanted you to know things that weren't in the will." I agreed immediately. That afternoon, I drove to his office, a stately brick building with ivy creeping up the side. The rain from the past few days had left the air cool and sharp. Inside, Mr. Carter ushered me into his study and closed the door. "Before we begin," he said, sliding a manila folder across the desk, "you need to understand your grandparents were deliberate. They knew exactly who they were dealing with." I opened the folder. Inside was a series of documents, bank statements, property titles, even offshore account records, all neatly organized. "What is all this?" I asked. "It's the contingency plan," he replied. "Your grandparents anticipated that the rest of your family might try to challenge the will, so they took steps to protect everything. What's in the will is only part of the estate. There are assets your relatives don't even know exist. Investments, land holdings, and trust funds that only activate under certain conditions." I leaned back, stunned. "They hid all of this." He nodded. "Not to deceive, but to shield you. If your family succeeded in overturning the will, these assets would still be yours. And there's more." From his desk drawer, he pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. I recognized my grandmother's handwriting on the first page. "For Claire when she's ready to know the truth." Inside were detailed entries, dates, events, conversations. My grandparents had documented years of subtle betrayals, loans that were never repaid, manipulations to keep me excluded, schemes to take advantage of my trust. There were even photos and copies of text messages. "They built a case," I whispered. "In a way, yes," Mr. Carter said, "but not for court, at least not initially. They wanted you to have the option. This is both protection and leverage." Then he told me something I didn't expect. "There's a network of people in this town who were close to your grandparents. Friends, colleagues, even former students they mentored. They made me promise that if things ever got difficult, I'd connect you with them." He handed me a folded piece of paper with a list of names and phone numbers. "These are people you can trust. They've seen what your family is capable of, and they'll stand with you if it comes to that." For a moment, I couldn't speak. I'd been feeling like I was standing alone against a tidal wave, but here was proof that I wasn't. Back at the house that evening, I sat at the dining table with the folder, the notebook, and the list of names spread out in front of me. The quiet in the house felt different now, charged like I was holding a map to something far bigger than I'd realized. Carlos stopped by and I told him everything. "This changes the game," he said, his eyes scanning the documents. "They think you're just one person with no backup. But you've got resources, proof, and allies. You can decide how to use them." That night, I dialed the first number on the list. A woman named Margaret picked up. She'd been my grandmother's best friend. "I've been waiting for your call," she said softly. "Your grandmother told me you'd be brave enough to fight when the time came." We spoke for an hour. She confirmed much of what was in the notebook and offered to introduce me to others who'd kept quiet out of loyalty to my grandparents. By the time I hung up, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks: control. Lying in bed, I realized the pieces were falling into place. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was building a strategy. And in that moment, I understood what my grandparents had really left me, not just wealth, but a framework for independence. Still, one thought kept me awake: if I had this much evidence and support, how would my family react when they realized I wasn't cornered, but prepared? The answer would come sooner than I expected, in a form I couldn't ignore. 3 mornings later, I woke to the faint buzz of my phone on the nightstand. It was still dark outside, the kind of deep, pre-dawn blue that makes you feel like the world is holding its breath. The caller ID read, "Unknown number." "Hello," I croaked. A man's voice measured calm, said Miss Bennett. "This is Officer Harris with the county police. We believe you should see something." By 7 a.m., I was at the station seated in a small interview room. Officer Harris slid a flash drive across the table. "Security footage," he said. "From a private camera across the street from your grandparents' house." I plugged it into the laptop they provided. The grainy video showed my Uncle Leonard standing outside the property 3 nights ago, close enough to touch the front gate. He wasn't alone. My cousin Emily was with him, her face obscured by a scarf. They carried something, a crowbar, a duffel bag, and disappeared from the frame toward the back of the house. My pulse quickened. "They didn't get inside," Harris said. "Alarm system probably scared them off. But the intent is clear. We can pursue charges if you'd like." I asked for a copy of the footage, and Harris obliged. As soon as I left the station, I called Mr. Carter. "This changes everything," I told him. "We're no longer talking about verbal threats, they're escalating." "Exactly," he said. "Now we can introduce your grandparents' documentation." Combined with this, it paints a very clear picture. That afternoon, Carlos and I began cataloging the evidence. We spread it across the dining table like a war map. The security footage of the break-in attempt. The financial statements showing years of exploitation. Handwritten entries from my grandmother's notebook, specific dates where family members plotted to isolate me. Screenshots of text messages with language sharp enough to cut glass. I realized we weren't just building a defense. We were preparing an offensive. By evening, my mind was racing. I stepped outside into the backyard, the air crisp with the scent of pine. Looking up at the stars, I thought about the last words my grandmother had spoken to me. "Protect yourself, Claire, but never lose your voice." That's when I decided this wasn't going to be about hiding. This was going to be about exposure. The next morning, I called 3 names from the list Mr. Carter had given me. They all agreed to meet at the house that weekend. These were people my grandparents had trusted, implicitly retired teachers, a local journalist, a former attorney. I wanted their insight and, more importantly, their presence when I confronted my family. Carlos grinned when I told him. "You're building your own jury," he said. Maybe he was right. That night I sat at my desk, drafting a letter. It was addressed to every family member involved, and it was deliberately simple. "I know what you've done. I have proof both past and present. You have one chance to come forward voluntarily before the truth comes out in a way you can't control. We will meet Sunday at 4 p.m. at the house. Be there." I printed and sealed each one, then sent them by courier the next morning. I didn't know if they would show up, but part of me hoped they would. Not because I wanted the drama, but because I wanted them to look me in the eye when they realized the narrative had shifted. And if they didn't, I had other ways of making sure their actions saw the light of day. As Sunday approached, the house felt charged, like the walls themselves knew something was coming. I rehearsed what I would say, but I also left space for the unknown, because in my gut, I sensed they wouldn't take this quietly. The evening before the meeting, Carlos leaned against the doorway of the study. "You ready for whatever happens?" he asked. I met his eyes. I'm ready for them to see I'm not alone anymore. And here's where I'm going to ask you, the listener. What would you do if the people you called family showed up at your doorstep after threatening you, knowing you had the power to destroy their reputation? Would you hold back? Or would you finally let everything spill? Stay with me, because what happened next was nothing like I expected. Sunday came with an overcast sky, the kind that seemed to hang heavy with unspoken tension. I woke early, pacing through the house like a sentry, checking every window, every lock. The long oak table in the dining room was already set, not with food, but with evidence. Every file, every photo, every grainy video still was neatly arranged in folders, each marked with a name. Carlos arrived around noon, carrying a tray of coffee and a look that said, "Today's the day." Mr. Carter came shortly after, briefcase in hand. "They'll come," he said, simply glancing at the clock. People like this can't resist the chance to control the narrative. By 3:45 p.m., the house felt electric. Through the front window, I spotted the first car, a sleek black sedan. My Uncle Leonard stepped out, his expression fixed in that smug half-smile I'd seen 1,000 times. Emily followed, avoiding my eyes. Minutes later, 2 more vehicles pulled in. My Aunt Diane, my cousin Mark, and finally my mother dressed like she was heading to Sunday brunch rather than a confrontation. At exactly 4:00 p.m., I opened the door. "Come in," I said, my voice steady but firm. They filed inside, glancing around as if expecting a trap. In a way, they weren't wrong. We gathered around the table. I didn't sit at the head. Instead, I stood at the center between the stacks of folders. "Thank you for coming," I began. "We need to be clear about what's been happening and what's going to happen next." Leonard snorted. "Cut the theatrics, Claire. We all know why we're here. The inheritance? It's not just about the inheritance," I cut in sharply. "It's about the lies, the theft, the manipulation. And it's about the fact that you tried to break into the house 3 nights ago." Emily's head jerked up. "That's ridiculous." I pressed a button on the remote. The TV behind me flickered to life, showing the security footage Officer Harris had given me. The room went still. Leonard's face, grainy but unmistakable, filled the screen. Emily's scarf-covered figure stood beside him. My mother's voice was a whisper. "Leonard? What were you thinking?" I slid a folder across the table. "That's your copy," I said. Inside were the police reports, the financial records, the notebook entries, every piece of it organized, time-stamped, undeniable. Diane flipped through hers, her hands trembling slightly. "Where did you get all this?" "Grandma and Grandpa kept everything," I replied. "They saw you all for who you are, and they made sure I would too." Mark leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "So what, you're just going to hold this over our heads forever?" "No," I said evenly. "I'm going to give you one choice. You can walk away, accept the will as it stands, and never contact me again unless it's in good faith. Or..." I tapped the folders. "I release everything. To the police, to the press, to everyone you've ever worked with." The silence was thick, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator. Leonard's jaw tightened. "You wouldn't dare." I met his stare. "Try me." My mother looked between us, her face pale. "Claire, you don't understand what this will do to the family name." I let out a bitter laugh. "The family name you destroyed that years ago. I'm just showing the receipts." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Emily pushed her folder away. "Fine, you win. I don't care anymore." Diane sighed, rubbing her temples. We'll walk away." "But Leonard," he just glared. "This isn't over," he muttered. "It is for me," I said, turning my back on him. "And now to you watching this. What would you do if one person in that room still refused to let go? Would you press harder or let them dig their own grave?" Leonard's glare burned into my back, but I didn't flinch. I could hear the scrape of his chair as he stood slow and deliberate like a predator circling. "You think you're clever, Claire?" he said, his voice low, almost conversational. "But you don't know the half of it." I turned, meeting his eyes, then enlightened me. He smiled, a cold, humorless curl of the lips. "You've been digging into our past. Well, I've been digging into yours. You're not as clean as you think." The room tensed. My mother leaned forward. "Leonard." "No," he snapped. "She should hear this. Our dear niece here has a history, doesn't she? Debt-failed relationships, a few questionable friends." I didn't look away. "If you're hoping to scare me, you're going to need something stronger than gossip." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small flash drive, holding it between 2 fingers. "This," he said, "contains proof that you've mishandled part of your inheritance already. Sold off assets without going through probate. That's a felony." Carlos spoke up from the corner, his voice like steel. "Probate wasn't required, Leonard. The will was airtight. We've reviewed every transaction, nothing illegal." Leonard's smugness faltered for just a fraction of a second, but he recovered quickly. "You think the police will see it that way?" I stepped closer, so close I could see the faint pulse at his temple. "If you had anything real, you'd have used it already. You're bluffing, Leonard, just like you always do." The flash drive dangled in his hand, but before he could respond, Mr. Carter stood, adjusting his tie. "Leonard, I've been patient, but I won't tolerate baseless threats in my client's home. If you persist, I will consider this harassment, and the next conversation you have will be with law enforcement." The shift in the room was immediate. Emily's eyes darted to the floor. Diane began rifling through her folder again, as if to avoid being pulled into the crossfire, and my mother. She just stared at Leonard, a silent plea in her expression. Leonard laughed, but it was brittle. "Fine. You want me gone, I'll go. But don't think this is the last time you'll see me." I straightened. "If you come near me or this house again without permission, it will be the last time, because you'll be dealing with a restraining order." He lingered a moment longer, as though daring me to blink first. I didn't. Finally, he turned and stalked out the front door, slamming hard enough to rattle the glass. The sound echoed, then faded, leaving a strange stillness behind. Emily muttered something about not wanting trouble and followed him out. Diane and Mark exchanged a look, then slipped away too. That left my mother. She stood clutching her purse, her voice soft. "Claire, I wish this had gone differently." "Me too," I said, but my tone made it clear I didn't mean reconciliation. She nodded faintly and left without another word. Carlos let out a long breath. Well, that was something. Mr. Carter closed his briefcase. "You held your ground. That's what matters. But be ready, Leonard's the type who plays the long game." "I know," I said quietly, "and so am I." That night, as the house settled into silence, I replayed every moment in my head. Leonard's threats, my mother's half-hearted attempts at peace, the way Emily had seemed almost relieved to walk away. But one thing stuck with me most, the glint in Leonard's eyes when he said this isn't over. It was a promise, and I intended to be ready when he tried to keep it. And here's where you come in. Would you go on the offensive, or would you lay low and wait for the next move? I didn't have to wait long for the next strike. It came in the form of Matthew arriving at my doorstep the next morning with a manila envelope so thick it was practically bursting at the seams. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. "It's time," he said, stepping inside. "We're done playing defense." I followed him into the kitchen, my coffee cooling on the counter. "What's in there?" He laid the envelope down like it was a live grenade. Everything. Bank records, fake invoices, wire transfers to offshore accounts. Leonard's name, Diane's signature, Emily's little consulting business that doesn't actually exist. My heart pounded. "Where did you get all this?" Matthew's grin was razor sharp. Let's just say an old accountant owed me a favor. They thought they buried their tracks, but greed makes people sloppy. We spread the documents across the table, page after page of betrayal made tangible. My eyes caught on one set of statements showing funds siphoned directly from my grandparents' charity foundation money, meant for scholarships, medical bills, food banks funneled into luxury condos and sports cars. I felt something hot rise in my chest. They didn't just try to take from me. They stole from people who needed it most. Mr. Carter arrived moments later, summoned by Matthew. He scanned the evidence with an approving nod. This is enough to trigger a criminal investigation, but it's also our leverage. If we go public now, they'll panic, and when they panic, they make mistakes. I knew he was right. But part of me wanted to walk straight to the police that second. The other part wanted to see their faces when they realized the game had turned. By evening, the stage was set. Matthew had accidentally let slip to a mutual acquaintance that we had something big. It took less than 3 hours for Leonard to call, his voice dripping with forced calm. "I hear you've been busy, Claire." "Just tying up loose ends," I said. "You should come by tomorrow. Bring the whole family. I'd like to have a conversation." The next day, the house was ready. The documents were neatly stacked in front of each chair at the dining table, labeled with the recipient's name. I sat at the head of the table, calm but electric inside. One by one they arrived. Leonard first, then Diane, Emily trailing behind, and finally my mother, looking like she wanted to be anywhere else. They barely had time to settle before I began. "What you're about to see is the truth, not my version of it, yours in black and white." I slid the stacks toward them. "Leonard, yours starts on page 3. Offshore accounts, Cayman Islands. Diane, page 7. Those fraudulent invoices you signed for a construction project that never happened. Emily, your consulting invoices for $15,000 a month to a shell company with your P.O. box." Emily's face drained of color. Diane flipped frantically through her pile, muttering, "This is taken out of context." Leonard didn't even look down. "You can't prove any of this will hold up in court." Matthew leaned forward, voice silky and dangerous. "You want to test that theory because the DA's office loves high-profile fraud cases, especially when charity money's involved." The room went dead silent. My mother's eyes flicked between us, a flicker of something fear crossing her face. I took a slow breath. "I told you before I wasn't going to be your victim. This is me keeping that promise." Leonard's jaw tightened. Emily looked like she might cry. Diane pressed her lips together so hard they turned white. Mr. Carter broke the silence. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to stop all claims against Claire's inheritance. You're going to return any misappropriated funds to the foundation within 30 days. And you're going to sign agreements stating that if you violate either term, all of this goes to the authorities." Leonard laughed once, but it was hollow. "And if we refuse?" Matthew's smile was ice. Then your next family meeting will be in a courtroom. No one spoke after that. The fight had drained out of them, replaced by something darker calculation weighing the odds. I could almost see the moment they realized they'd lost control. And yet I knew this wasn't over. Not completely. Because some people don't surrender, they just bide their time. But for now, the balance had shifted, and I intended to keep it that way. Would you have taken the deal, or burned them to the ground right then and there? Because in my case, I was about to find out what happens when you push people like this too far. The deal was on the table, and I could see the war playing out behind their eyes. Leonard leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled like he was trying to project control, but his knee was bouncing under the table. Emily kept glancing at Diane, silently begging for guidance. Diane. Well, Diane was staring at me with the kind of cold fury that would have frozen anyone else. Mr. Carter slid the agreements across the table. Read them carefully, sign them now, or this entire file gets duplicated and sent to the district attorney by sunset. His tone was calm, almost bored, but that boredom was a blade they knew he meant every word. Leonard smirked, trying to regain some ground. You're bluffing. Matthew chuckled under his breath. About the DA, no. About having only one copy, definitely. He tapped the manila envelope in front of him. There are 5 more in safe hands waiting for my call. The tension in the room thickened. I didn't say a word. This wasn't the moment to gloat. It was the moment to let them imagine every headline, every whispered conversation at their country club, every investor suddenly backing away. Diane was the first to crack. She snatched up her copy eyes, scanning the pages, her pen scratching against the paper moments later. Emily followed suit, her hand trembling so badly she had to steady it with the other. Leonard was last. He stared at me for a long time before picking up the pen. You think this makes you untouchable? He asked quietly. I held his gaze. No, but it makes me free. He signed. Once the papers were collected, Matthew tucked them into a leather folder like they were crown jewels. Mr. Carter stood smoothing his jacket. We'll be in touch with the foundation's accountant to ensure the funds are returned. If you miss the 30-day deadline, you know the consequences. Leonard muttered something under his breath, but no one asked him to repeat it. Diane stormed out without looking at me. Emily lingered at the door for a moment like she wanted to say something, an apology maybe. But in the end, she followed her parents into the waiting car. The house was silent again except for the faint ticking of the kitchen clock. My hands were still clenched, my shoulders tight. I thought I'd feel triumphant, but instead there was a hollow ache in my chest. This was the closest thing to justice I'd ever get from them, and it still wasn't clean. Matthew poured himself a coffee and slid into the chair across from me. You did it, Claire. You've got your life back. I shook my head. I have my freedom. But I'll never get back the years they took from me. That night, I sat on the back porch with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, watching the sky shift from orange to deep indigo. My phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. Be careful. They're not finished. I stared at it for a long time before deleting it. I didn't need the warning. I knew exactly what people like Leonard did when they felt cornered. Still, I had no regrets. For the first time in years, I was steering my own ship, and if they wanted to come after me again, they'd find I wasn't the same person they'd once bullied into silence. And just so you know, this wasn't the end. Not even close. Because 3 weeks later, on the very day the repayment was due, something arrived in the mail that made me realize Leonard had one last card to play. But that is a story you'll want to hear to the very end. 3 weeks later, the morning sunlight spilled across my kitchen table as I sipped coffee and tried to convince myself that the worst was behind me. The 30-day deadline Mr. Carter set had expired that morning. By law and by the agreements they'd signed, Leonard and the others should have already wired the money back into the foundation's account. But my phone was quiet, too quiet. No confirmation from the bank, no call from Mr. Carter. Then I heard the clatter of the mail slot. I didn't think much of it, just another pile of bills and junk flyers. But when I picked up the stack, one envelope stood out. Thick, cream-colored with Leonard's personal letterhead embossed in gold. My stomach tightened. I slid a finger under the flap and pulled out a single sheet of paper. No greeting, no pleasantries, just a typed message in his usual infuriatingly smug style. Claire, we've fulfilled our part on paper, but life is longer than 30 days. Consider this a reminder that debts come in many forms. L. Taped to the bottom of the letter was a photocopy of an old photograph. I froze when I saw it. It was me 10 years younger, standing beside a man I barely remembered. The grainy image was cropped in a way that made it look like something it wasn't something damaging. The implication was clear. Leonard had found a way to keep a hook in me. It wasn't about money anymore, it was about control. Matthew arrived 20 minutes later after I called him, my voice shaking. He studied the letter, then the photo, then me. "This is a bluff," he said finally. If he had real ammunition, he'd have used it already. But I knew Leonard. He didn't need real ammunition, just enough to plant doubt to make people question me. I spent the next 2 days in a fog, wrestling with whether to confront him or ignore it. Mr. Carter's advice was clinical. He's probing for a reaction. The best move is no move. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only a test shot. On the third day, something shifted. I was walking past the community center where I taught my weekend literacy class when I overheard 2 volunteers discussing the Foundation's scholarship fund. "It's amazing," one of them said. "She didn't just keep the money, she's building something for all of us." It hit me then I had a choice. I could spend my energy parrying Leonard's games, or I could double down on the very things he wanted to destroy: my work, my reputation, my independence. That night I made a decision. I called the accountant and moved $10 million into a new education fund. The fund's mission would be public, transparent, and impossible for Leonard to tarnish without making himself look worse. Then I drafted a letter to the local paper detailing the Foundation's expansion and the lives it was already changing. By the next morning, the story was front-page news. Leonard's letter suddenly looked small against the backdrop of dozens of smiling students and grateful parents. Matthew was grinning when he brought me the paper. "You didn't just take the high road," he said. "You built a whole damn highway." But I wasn't naive. I knew Leonard wouldn't disappear quietly. Still, I'd shifted the battlefield onto terrain where he couldn't win without revealing his own cruelty. And maybe I was starting to understand the real legacy my grandparents wanted me to protect. Because power wasn't in the bank account. It was in the lives you touched, the communities you lifted, and the strength to stand your ground, even when the storm kept circling. What I didn't know yet was that one final encounter with Leonard would seal this chapter for good, and it would happen in front of an audience neither of us could control. And that would be the day I finally saw the last of his power crack. The auditorium buzzed with chatter, the kind of low, restless energy that swells before a big announcement. Rows of folding chairs filled the community hall, and at the front, a banner stretched across the stage: Claire Whitman Education Fund Annual Scholarship Awards. I stood backstage, heart steady but alert. Today was supposed to be about the students, 10 bright young people receiving full scholarships to universities across the country, but I knew Leonard too well. If he was going to try to claw back control, he'd do it where the spotlight burned the brightest. Sure enough, as I peeked through the curtain, I saw him. Leonard sat in the third row, legs crossed, an expression halfway between boredom and calculation. 2 of my cousins flanked him like lieutenants. When the program began, I walked out into the warm glare of stage lights. Applause filled the air. I smiled at the crowd, not for show, but because despite everything, this moment was real. I spoke about the vision of the fund, about my grandparents' belief that education was the purest form of empowerment. I could see Leonard's jaw tighten when I mentioned honoring their exact wishes. Then, as I invited the first scholarship recipient to the stage, Leonard made his move. He stood up, interrupting with a loud, fake laugh that made the audience turn toward him. "Before we all get too sentimental," he said, stepping into the aisle, "maybe Claire should explain how she really came into this fortune. Maybe the truth isn't as clean as she wants you to think." Gasps rippled through the crowd. I let the silence hang for just a moment before I spoke. "Leonard, if you have something to say, please say it here in front of everyone." His smirk faltered, but he pulled out the same photocopied picture he'd mailed me. Holding it up, he tried to spin his narrative, suggesting I'd been involved in something shady years ago. Before the whispers could spread, Matthew, who was seated in the front row, rose and took the microphone from the podium. "That's a cropped and doctored image," he said firmly, "and we have the original plus sworn affidavits and timestamps that prove it." Mr. Carter joined him, holding up a manila envelope. "We also have evidence ironclad that Leonard and several others attempted to coerce Ms. Whitman into forfeiting her legal inheritance through threats and manipulation. Copies of this have already been delivered to the district attorney." The audience shifted, murmuring in disgust, not at me but at Leonard. For the first time, I saw panic in his eyes. The predator had been dragged into the light and there was nowhere to run. He muttered something about misunderstandings before storming toward the exit. I could have stopped the program, but I didn't. Instead, I turned back to the students waiting on stage. "Shall we continue?" I asked, my voice stronger than I felt. One by one, the recipients stepped forward to accept their awards. The applause grew louder with each name. By the time the last scholarship was given, the tension in the room had been replaced by something electric: hope. After the ceremony, people surrounded me, parents thanking me, reporters asking for quotes, students hugging me so tightly I could barely breathe. I caught sight of Leonard outside the hall, standing alone by his car watching. For a brief moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But as the door closed and the voices inside swelled again, I knew that whatever power he once had over me was gone. Completely. As the evening wound down, Matthew leaned over and whispered, "Now you send them to the next video." It made me laugh, half because it was his way of telling me to keep the momentum going, half because it reminded me this wasn't the end of my story. If you've stayed with me through all of this, then you know life will test you over and over. And if you want to see what happened when I faced my next challenge, one that started with a single unexpected letter, you're going to want to hear that story. The night after the scholarship ceremony, I sat on my porch, a mug of tea warming my hands, the quiet hum of summer crickets filling the air. The tension of the past months felt like a storm that had finally broken, leaving the air clean and cool. From where I sat, I could see the garden I'd planted, that spring rose of tomatoes, wildflowers swaying in the breeze, a small apple tree at the center. It had started as a way to keep my hands busy during the hardest moments, but somewhere along the way, it became something more. Every bloom, every sprout felt like a piece of my life reclaiming itself. Matthew joined me carrying a blanket. He draped it over my shoulders without a word, then settled beside me. For a while, we didn't talk. We didn't need to. When I finally spoke, my voice was steady. "You know, I used to think that freedom was something you had to earn from other people, that you had to convince them you were worthy of it." I smiled faintly, watching the fireflies blink over the lawn. "But it turns out freedom isn't theirs to give. It's yours to take." He nodded, "And you did." "The truth is, Leonard's shadow will always be somewhere out there. People like him don't disappear. They just find new corners to lurk in. But now his power over me is gone, not because I defeated him in some grand battle, but because I chose to live without his approval." The next morning I found a letter in the mailbox. This time it wasn't a threat or a smear. It was from one of the scholarship recipients, handwritten on lined paper. They wrote about their dreams, about the weight lifted from their family's shoulders, and how they promised to one day do the same for someone else. I folded the letter carefully and tucked it into my journal. Maybe this was the real victory, not winning in court, not exposing the lies, but planting something that would grow long after I was gone. The sun rose higher, painting the porch in gold. I took a deep breath, the air sweet with the scent of blooming jasmine, and thought, this is mine. My life, my choices, my peace. And for the first time in years, that was enough.